Hello and welcome to another episode of the Thoughtfully Made Fiber Vlogcast. My name is Amy Scher and I am a knitting pattern designer and knitting teacher and general fiber artist here in St. Louis, Missouri. Today I am here to address all your concerns about unspun yarn. Being a knitting designer, I often have yarns that I fall out of in love with, and I cycle through my love for different yarns. I think that's true of everybody, but for me, I have had a solid love for unspun yarn for well over a year now, and this year I have quite a few designs coming out in unspun yarns, and so many of my readers on Instagram have been asking me for a video or compilation of tips or something to help them understand and not be afraid of working with unspun yarn. So if you are new to unspun, this is a great video for you. And if you are not new to unspun, we'll explore a few things together and maybe we can trade tips because I'm definitely not an expert. I have knit quite a few garments. You can see like my little pile of my little partial pile of stuff I've knit in unspun yarn here. This little pile here is Och Eir Nutiden, which is a brand in a Swedish brand that uses Swedish wool. They have a small mill and they make unique limited edition blends of different colors. These are dyed in the lock and like sheared, washed, dyed, and then blended and carded to make unspun yarn. So unspun yarn usually comes in forms like this. These are called plates. The units are called plates, and they're basically cut off like the mill equipment, just like this, like they get pulled off, cut into chunks. It comes in like a big long tube of these, and they're basically fiber that's been drafted out into like a little pencil roving, and you knit with it. But because they have no twist, they'll just pull apart like that. And I think that makes a lot of knitters justifiably a little worried. So we're gonna kind of get into it and talk about how we can prevent breakage and just have a generally better experience. So I've got all my notes written here. All right, so the first thing that you need to know about unspun is that the fiber content matters so much. So without getting into like too much spinning jargon, in a regular spun and milled yarn, the fiber content, whatever the fiber is, works with the way that it's prepared. So whether it's been carded or it's also been combed, worsted versus woolen preparation, how it's spun, how much twist is put into the fiber, and then how many plies and how much twist is put in while plied. All of those factors will affect how a yarn knits, feels, wears, drapes, all of those things. But in unspun yarn, you have pretty much this, like, it's just fiber. It's just fiber. So the fiber content matters more than ever. So even in this little pile of knitted in here, each colorway is distinct, and this gray one here was actually so hard to knit. It had a higher proportion of fine wool in it, and that made it quite delicate. The staple length, which means the length of the little fiber when it's sheared off the sheep, is shorter than some of the long wools that Nutiden often has. And I knew that going in, I knew that this was going to be like I knew that it was going to be a more fine wool dominant blend, so I just had to take extra care and take care of it and just be really careful and use all my tips and slow down. The biggest tip is to slow down. So there are trade-offs. Some of the unspun brands that I have more of a blend of guard hairs and non-guard hairs from old heritage breeds of sheep, and some of them are more fine wool and require a little more care. The fine wool ones are obviously softer and they wear like butter, but they do take a little more care when knitting. So when you choose your first unspun yarn, you might want to watch out for that. And you know, if you want to dive into a fine wool, do your thing, but you might have an easier time if you use one of the more rustic ones, even though they might not be as comfortable. But if you have skin sensitivities, by all means, jump into the fine wool. So before we get into the tips, I want to talk a little bit about why you might want to select unspun for a project versus not. So an unspun yarn, by its very nature, is going to be very lofty, all right, because it hasn't been twisted. When you twist fiber and it becomes thinner and it holds less air. But an unspun yarn has all that air stored within the strand between the little fibers, and it creates a super warm fabric, right? In the same, for example, DK weight strand that knits up at the same gauge or even more open, it's gonna be lighter. So all of these sweaters are under 500 grams. Most of them under, this one that I knit at a super big gauge, this gray one here, this super light gray off-white one was less than 300 grams. Can you believe that? You use so little fiber, but it holds so much air, and counterintuitively that actually makes the sweater much warmer because it's the air being held between fibers that's warm and insulates. So that's one reason why you might want to use unspun. The other reason is for its qualities, for how the fabric appears. So for example, the one that I'm wearing right now is unspun knit in color work, and it has like a very melded look. I know that a lot of traditional color work is knit from woolen spun yarn, and this has that kind of same effect. Unspun yarn, like woolen spun yarn, will expand or bloom to kind of fill the space that it's given, and it does so even more dramatically than woolen spun yarn. So it creates like a very cohesive, very melody fabric, and it kind of lightly felts, like the stitches kind of want to stick together and felt together a little bit. Over time, with wear, with wash, it keeps becoming more cohesive all the time. It does pill a bit, but with like the heathered, like because all the colors are so heathered and variegated within the strand itself, it doesn't really show pills very much. So let's show it in lace too. So here it is in lace. It's a lace shawl that I've made and loved. So you can see that the lace, and actually all stitch patterns on it, are going to be a little more textural than defined. And that can create quite a different look if, you know, for the fabric design, if that is the look if that's the look you're going for, then it's a great option for that. It'll behave basically like a woolen spun yarn, but more. And then when it's knit up in stockinette, it's very melded, as I've already mentioned. And I've got a cable example here. When you knit it up in cable, this one is one of mine. This one's called the Seasons Change Pullover. I designed it for Making Magazine, and it has some cables in it. And for those who can't access Making Magazine, this will be coming this year as an individual pattern. But as you can see with cable and with the seed stitch here, it's quite textural rather than defined. It creates more like a mood and textural situation rather than like pop and cable. So if you want a yarn that is very defined and very plump in cables and has really crisp, you know, the 3D cables that stand up, this is not that yarn. It's definitely more textural, and it creates a very different look, and you can really substitute it for a lot of worsted to Aran weight yarns and patterns like cable patterns that use those yarns to great effect. It'll create an incredible fabric that's very different from the design sample, and you can get some interesting fabrics that way. So I wanted to show you briefly some of the unspun yarns I have. This one is by Wooldreamers. This is called Manchelopi. It's so named because it has the same, the fiber that comes from the same sheep that give us Manchego cheese. This one is in the colorway Azul. They are I think, Spanish company that works with their local farmers and mills to create all kinds of yarns. I've used them before for other patterns. This one is just in my collection right now. So I really like that one. I would say that this one, the fiber feels more dense. I think it's more crimpy, and the staple lengths are a little shorter, but it creates a softer hand than the Nutiden. And this one is the Nutiden. I've already shown it. They come in unique colors, so you can't get this one. Every month or every other month or so, they release like 5 to 6 colors. And they always talk about how, because of the way the yarn is spun and how little there is in the processing, the humidity in the room, the temperature, the particular bale of wool that they receive that they're processing, the particular blend of fibers for each color is going to be different, and that's why they're different all the time. And I will say, because Unspun expands to fill the space that you give it, even though the thickness of the strand might be different, it will like consistently knit up too. I find it pretty comfortable. Nutiden and Manchelopi are both pretty comfortable for me to knit at 14 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, all the way up to like 18 for garments, 20, 22 for accessories. I think you can get away with that. So it has a huge range, and this is held double. Sorry, I should have said that. Held double. It reaches 14 stitches to 22 stitches very comfortably, very easily. It's nice at all those weights. I've got sweaters here. The cable one, this one was 14 stitches, and you can see it creates like a more open look, a more puffy look, and it's not transparent. It's opaque. It kind of opens up to fill in the space that you give it. And then these two are knit at 18 stitches. The one I'm wearing, I think, was like 19, something like that. So it's very flexible in gauge, and that's one of the things I love about it. And then the very last one I have in my collection right now is this one. It's called Thrive, and it's by Woollentwine over at Woollentwine. This one is also local, and it's very sheepy. It's like very minimally processed. And you know those like exhibition farms that you get here in the Midwest where you can go and see the sheep? This smells like that. So if that's not for you, don't get it. It's very much my jam. I love it so much. And I have a design upcoming using Thrive, and I'm really excited. Yule's lines are particularly, she always has them milled up undyed using local wool. So that's really cool. So my biggest tip is to wind your unspun up into the balls. I will insert some footage here, but basically you sit down, you get 2 plates of your color, drop them down on the floor, and you pull them up together for double balls. And I do recommend for your first project, or even like your first 5 projects, to use it doubled. You roll them up into little double balls of unspun yarn, and they're doubled, and they look like this. And I recommend that you don't roll them up into balls much bigger than like a softball size, just because the reason why we want to roll them into double balls is that so that when they're in your yarn basket or whatever you're putting them in and you're yanking at them while you're knitting, they'll roll instead of break. And when they get too big, the weight of the ball itself is going to kind of weigh down the fiber, and then when you yank, it breaks. So you want it to roll. You don't want it to just sit, and when you yank at it a little too hard while knitting, it breaks. And I do definitely recommend that you knit them double the first time. So I work from double balls. I wind them in groups of like 2 plates at a time. So I'll wind up 2 plates completely into balls, use them, wind up 2 more, etc. And if you have an odd number of plates, you have to do that like logic game where you wind up half of one with half of another, and then switch to a full plate, and then wind up half of the remaining one, the remaining half of the first one, and then half of that one, and then now you have 2 half plates left over, and you wind those together. So that's how I do that. And then my second tip is that when you break your unspun, and you will break your unspun, you can join together. Oh, I've just done that. Okay. You can join it together really easily. So I've got 4 strands here of unspun yarn. So say these are 2 double strands that I've broken. Oh no. And this is so gross, but I will just spit felt it. I'll hold all 4 strands, the ends of all 4 strands together, and just add a little moisture. Sometimes I keep a little spray bottle on my desk for this, but you don't really need to with unspun. You can do this with all feltable yarn, so like all non-superwash, but it works super well with unspun. You just hold the ends together, felt it a little, and then you just keep knitting. Now there's one long double strand that's slightly felted together. So that's my other tip, is that you don't worry about the ends, you just felt them in. You'll still have the ones from color work and the ones at the beginning and the end. And when you join new parts, and I do recommend that you always, that's my third tip, you always weave in your ends before you wash. And if you come to any of my knitting classes, you will know that I always recommend students weave in ends after washing, because the fabric changes, right? The stitches expand, they grow, and then when you weave in before, it can distort it and prevent that section of stitches from expanding the same way as all the other stitches. But with Unspun, just weave it in. It's not worth the trouble, and it'll expand because, you know, the yarn drafts open like that. So it'll expand just the way that it needs to, and that's fine. And then you won't have any like weird short broken ends to deal with at the end. Just weave in those ends as you go. The fourth tip I have is that if you're using a pattern that does not recommend, that has like the recommended yarn is not an unspun yarn, you're gonna have to swatch for your ribbing. I find that unspun ribbing very much puffs up and wants to expand. So I always have to go down at least 2 sizes. I don't think I've ever done 3 sizes. So I usually go down 2 sizes from the main fabric needle. That's for stockinette. If you're doing color work, you might have to go down 3 sizes. Yeah, because color work, we usually go up 1 size. For most knitters, not all. But for color work, I go up a size. So that means the ribbing, I'm down 3 sizes from the color work and 2 sizes from the stockinette. So yeah, just to get the gauge. So hopefully your designer has given you a ribbing gauge and you can swatch for it, but basically you don't want the ribbing to flip. You don't want the ribbing fabric to be wider than the stockinette fabric, so you can definitely swatch for that and see how the ribbing grows. So that's my 4th tip. And then my 5th tip, I'm gonna go into an inserted footage and I'm gonna show you how to seam or basically how to sew. I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of tubular bind off for you in an overhead video, so enjoy that. So believe it or not, it is possible to do a seamed garment or tubular bind off or any kind of sewn bind off using an unspun yarn. I am demonstrating this part using Nutiden, and basically I twist it a bit and get it small enough and crunched down enough to get it through the needle. And then what you've got to do next is spin the yarn, which sounds wild, I know, but what you're going to do is you're going to leverage that end there using your needle and just kind of twist the yarn to give it a little bit of a spin and make the yarn stronger. The twist will hold the fibers in the new twisted yarn and create almost like a single ply yarn that will be quite a lot stronger to work with. And I would work with no more than this much, this arm's length worth of yarn, because it is more fragile, it will break, and you can just spit felt in new yarn, which can be a little tricky, but it's better to me than something breaking on you halfway. So here you can see I'm starting work on my tubular bind off, and while I pull the yarn through, you have to be really careful and keep your fingers close to the placement of the stitch. Don't yank from very far away. Anytime you pull the yarn through, as much as you can, get your hand close to where the point of tension is going to be, where you're trying to pull it through, and that way you have less yarn that can draft out. That small, strong bit will hold together better if it's not a long bit, given the chance to draft out a lot. This is also true if you're frogging the yarn. As you're frogging it, keep your hands close to where the stitches are. Don't yank from far away. With all other yarns that are not unspun, I typically frog using a ball winder, but that's not going to fly here. You're going to have to frog pulling each stitch away as close as you can, and you'll get a feel for it. But this is also why I always recommend buying an extra plate if it's your first time, just to make sure that any practicing or errors that you make can be rectified. So you can see here my yarn is holding together and then not much drafting is happening. It's not like pulling apart. The fibers are holding together because of the twist that I put in. And as I work, If I find that there's not enough twist actually, and it is starting to, drift apart a little bit, I'll just give it a little extra twist, and that's okay, it happens. And now I'm making my way across this sleeve hem, and you can see how neat and strong and stretchy this tubular bind off is. So you don't have to give up finishes like tubular bind off when you are working with Unspun. It's definitely possible. I would not recommend it on your very first project, but on subsequent projects, definitely give it a try. Maybe try it out on a little swatch just like this and work your way up from there for your confidence. You can do it. So I want to talk a little bit about why I like using Unspun and why you might not want to use Unspun. So for me, the positive of Unspun is that it's a great way to get really cozy and get really into less processed fiber. You get so much closer to the fiber. There's no twist, no plies to hide behind, just fiber. So it's a great way to get to know fiber. It's a great way to get to know how yarn becomes fabric. All the best qualities of woolen spun yarn are amplified. The loftiness, how lightweight it is, how much air it holds, and how warm it is. All of those things are like even more so in Unspun. And in cables, you can reduce, like if you don't like how defined a particular pattern's cables are, using worsted spun yarn or even woolen spun yarn, you can control that. You can reduce that even further by using unspun yarn to create a very different fabric. In color work, it creates a very melded fabric. It's very steek friendly because of the way the fabric will lightly felt on its own. You can even like go in and needle felt it with no effort at all for the steek, and it's very easy for that. You might not want to wear Unspun if you have sensitive skin. Yeah, it's only been carded. It's not been combed. So the fibers are not in like straight alignment. They're going to be kind of chaotic within the strand, and that means the ends will be kind of poking out. And just by nature, many unspun yarns use kind of longer, higher micron count fibers. That's just what they are. That's part of the makeup of this type of fiber and this type of yarn. So if that's not for you, don't use unspun yarn. Let's see, what else do I have here? If you are a habitual yanker, you will have to retrain yourself. And that's something only you can decide if you want to do that or not. So it might not be for you if you're like a habitual yanker and you're not looking to slow down and like change the way you knit. If you want a more weighty fabric, you like a more compressive feel, this is not going to be for you. It is such a pliable fabric. It's so drapey that if you prefer to wear like a more sturdy feeling yarn, it's not the yarn for you. Not to say that it isn't sturdy. Yeah, there is twist that is added when we knit, and when we roll the ball, a little bit of twist is added. And then as we form the little loops for the knit stitches, it does actually interlock. And again, upon block, it kind of lightly felts together. So it's kind of like a felt fabric. Very lightly. There's still defined stitches and it's still stretchy, so it hasn't felted. It's just bloomed and fold a little bit, and you can control that a lot by washing it more or less. So those are all kind of the reasons why you might want to get into unspun or not get into unspun. So now that we've gone through all these tips and all my thoughts about why you might like or not like unspun, I hope that helps you make a decision. And if you'd like to check out my pattern that is knit from an unspun yarn from Nutiden, one of my favorites, I will put the link for my new pattern below. It's called the Building Blocks Drop. It is a basic drop shoulder sweater using unspun or woolen spun yarn. It's got pockets and perfect underarm shaping. I'll talk more about that next week, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, don't forget to subscribe.